God, we want to open our hearts to you this morning through your word, and so we pray you'd use it to speak to us. We just open ourselves, our desires, our hearts, our minds to you. Use this time. In Jesus' name, amen. This morning we continue our study in the book of Esther by looking at Esther chapters 5 and 6 today. If you remember back when we started the study of Esther, we used this metaphor of a chess match, and that the characters in the book of Esther are all represented by various chess pieces on the board. And yet God doesn't show up directly in the story of Esther, but we wouldn't expect him to, because he's not one of the pieces on the board, but he is the invisible hand moving all of those pieces around, working out his plan. We're going to see that again here today, this morning. What we've seen throughout the entire book of Esther is this, our main idea, that God can be trusted even when he cannot be seen, because he works his invincible plans even in the midst of his invisible presence. And so just by way of review, we saw in Esther chapter 1, we met King Ahasuerus, and we saw him depose his queen Vashti. And we really got a glimpse into Ahasuerus' character. Then in Esther chapter 2, we saw that the king needed a queen, which allowed Esther to rise to the position of queen. And then in Esther 3, we saw Haman, the enemy of the Jews, Haman, rise to power, and ultimately Haman construct this plan to annihilate all the Jews. And then 2 weeks ago, when we studied Esther chapter 4, we saw Esther respond to these crises of identity and courage and faith, knowing that the Lord had placed her for just this time to save his people. So what we're going to see this morning now as we continue is we're going to see that courage on display. Esther chapter 4 finished up with Esther instructing Mordecai and the Jews to fast for her for 3 days. Well, that time is up, and now we're going to see Esther move forward as our active heroine, orchestrating her plan, all of this within the invincible plans of the invisible God. One of the things I love about the story of Esther is how we see her use wisdom and faith together to move forward to do exactly what God has called her to do. So we're going to see that courage on display here as we begin reading Esther chapter 5. We're going to read Esther chapter 5, verses 1 through 8 to begin. I invite you to read with me. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of his scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. As they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Let's stop right there for just a minute. So now this is on the third day of that time of fasting that Esther had instructed Mordecai and the Jews to fast on her behalf. And surely during this time, Esther had been also praying, but she had also been planning. What we're going to see throughout this entire section is how Esther, as I mentioned earlier, brings together wisdom, preparation, and planning, and she brings that together with faith and trust in the Lord and his ability to work. So she puts on her royal robe and prepares to go into the throne room of the king. For much of this part of the rest of the book of Esther, when it refers to Esther, it's going to call her Queen Esther. She takes on fully that identity of where God has placed her, who God has created her to be, this queen right now for such a time as this, and she goes into the throne room. Now, we learned last time in Esther chapter 4 that there's great fear here, because if the king doesn't reach out his scepter, there's a chance that she could be killed because she has not been invited into the throne room. Now, that fear is very warranted. There is archaeological evidence of reliefs that have been found, artistic drawings from the Persian kingdom where we see the Persian king sitting on his throne holding a scepter, and behind the king is a big old soldier, big burly man with a giant axe. And the picture is that man is there ready to protect the king if someone comes who is uninvited. Now, you and I know the end of the story, or at least we do if we've read it, and we know that it all turns out okay. But remember, Esther doesn't. Esther doesn't know that. So there's reason perhaps for her to be fearful if she doesn't have trust in the Lord and in his plans. And so Esther goes in. Now, what's funny is that many times when at least for me, when I think about this scene, and perhaps it's because of the movies that I've seen that play out this story, I often think of Esther making this big dramatic entrance into the throne room and bursting open the doors, right, and running in and making this big scene. But the text doesn't lead us that direction. The text simply tells us that she stood in the corner of the king's palace, and she, in a sense, waited for him to see her. And I think she's very strategic in this. She's very wise in this, that she's not going to make a big scene, but she's going to put herself in a position to be seen by the king and then ultimately be invited up. Remember, she's got wisdom and faith together. Ultimately, when she stepping in faith, she wins the favor of the king, just like we've seen Esther do several times already. This is an active process on her part. And the king promises, what would you like, Esther? He reaches out the scepter to her. She touches that. What would you like, my queen? Even up to half of my kingdom. An idiom to say that the king is predisposed to be gracious to her. Well, what does she do? Well, she asks the king for a date, for a dinner date. But not just for the two of them. She wants a third wheel on this dinner date. She wants the king to invite Haman. And she has this meal all ready to go. Remember, this is a woman who has been planning and preparing and praying and fasting at the same time. And this meal is ready to go. Her plan is ready. And so she asks the king and Haman to come to this meal. Now, the text tells us after the meal, during the drinking of the wine, the king asks her again, what would you like, my queen? Now, they haven't been waiting around on this. This time of drinking wine at the end of the meal, this was the time that business deals were done. So very culturally, some cultural references here. This is when the business would have happened. My queen, tell me what you would like. And Esther here makes the request for the king and for Haman to come to a second feast the next day. That's her request. Now, what's happening here? Why does Esther ask for a second feast? I believe Esther does not ask for a second feast because she's uncertain or she's lost her nerve or because she's just trying to build suspense for what's coming. I don't think that's why. I think Esther has a bigger and a better plan. I think Esther asks the king to come to a second feast because what she does here is she ties together Ahasuerus' attendance to the second feast with the guarantee that he will fulfill this request that she's going to make. So what happens here is that if the king refuses to come to the second meal, it's basically like he's admitting that he never meant to fulfill her request in the first place. And if the king promises to attend this second meal, it's essentially a guarantee that he will fulfill whatever she asks. There would be no way out. See, I think Esther, what she's done here is that she has maneuvered the king into a place where there's no way that he can say no to her request. Remember, she's active, she's planning, she's thoughtful in this. Prayerful and planning coming together here. And so she invites Ahasuerus, would you come to a second banquet? And in coming, you're going to be guaranteeing me that just by showing up, you're going to give me what I ask for. Now, at the close of this meal, and Ahasuerus agreeing and Haman agreeing to come back, the enemy here, Haman, he has no idea what's going on, right? His vision is clouded by his own pride. And we'll see here that pride is going to be on full display in verses 9 through 14. Let's read those. And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above all the officials and the servants of the king. And then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast that she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all of this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." Well, this idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. Our chess piece for Haman, if you'll remember, is the knight chess piece. And the knight's a tricky piece because it moves in an unusual way, allowing it to attack from an unexpected position. But our proverb for Haman is Proverbs 16:18, which says, "Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall." And that's why this sermon is called A Night of Pride, a little wordplay on the idea of night. Haman is both the knight in our metaphor, but this is also happening at night where we see his pride on full display. Haman leaves the feast joyful, very excited. "Look how great I am that I got to go to this feast as just the guest of Queen Esther and Ahasuerus." But he becomes furious upon seeing Mordecai, who will once again no longer rise and no longer bow down to him. So he goes home. What does he do? He grabs his cheering squad, his yes men around him, and he strokes his own ego, talking about how great and awesome he is, how he has the promotions, how he has the sons, how he has all of these wonderful things except Mordecai. So his wife Zeresh makes a suggestion. Well, Haman, have gallows built 50 cubits high, about 75 feet high. And these gallows would not have been like we might think with like a hangman's noose, but these gallows would have been a giant stake upon which the enemy, in this case, in Haman's world, Mordecai, would have been impaled. Now, 75 feet tall is actually taller, ancient historians tell us, than even the palace in Susa. And thus you see very clearly Haman's objective is humiliation and disgrace for Mordecai. It's very subtle here, though, but there's some irony that with Zeresh here offering this counsel, telling Haman what he ought to do, what we see is that the wife here is in some ways leading Haman, which is the exact opposite of the initial edict that went out in Esther chapter 1. The idea there was that husbands can do whatever they want and everyone else listens to them. But here we have, in a comical way, Haman listening to his wife. Now, what does pride do to us, right? What does pride do? A couple things, at least a couple things. One thing it does is it forces us to believe that nothing will ever be enough. You know, Haman had it all. He had the promotions. He had everything in the kingdom except being the king himself. He had it all, except it wasn't enough because there was one individual, one lowly individual who wouldn't do what he wanted, and that pushed him over the edge. Pride made him that way, where nothing would ever be enough. But pride also blinded Haman to reality. It distorted his view of what was possible and what was right and wrong. Here Haman thinks that he's just going to be able to execute Mordecai. He's going to be able to execute whatever he wants to whomever he wants. And he's just going to walk into the presence of the king and say, "King, I need this individual killed." And he thinks the king is going to go along with it. And there's no thought of, well, should I? Or even could I? He just thinks this is what he's going to do. It clouds his perspective over the whole situation. And it clouds his ability to see ultimately what's about to come. What Haman doesn't know will hurt him. One commentator, Frederick Bush, says this. I love this little statement. He says, Haman's decision to speak to the king in the morning about having Mordecai hanged meets with a set of coincidences so remarkable that they can hardly be anything but the narrator's cipher for divinely arranged. It's the narrator telling us, but these coincidences are so remarkable that the only way to read it is divinely arranged. Now, Frederick Bush goes on to say this, and I love this. This is a line I love. Haman's plans are about to run head on into the providence of God. I love that. Head on into the providence of God. We've seen Esther's courage on display. We've seen Haman's pride on display, but now we're going to see God's providence on display in chapter 6. Now, when we say providence, before we read chapter 6, when we say providence, we mean this. We mean God's sovereign, complete, and gracious control over all things, that he is overseeing all things, working out his will. And we're going to see that on full display in chapter 6. So let's read it together. On that night, the same night where Haman's building the gallows, on that night the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." And the king said, "Who's in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man who the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Who would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." I mean, you can imagine Haman's face right there. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, and Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. That would be the second feast. God's providence on display. Esther chapter 6, verse 1 is the turning point of the entire book. We have 3 feasts before this verse. We have 3 feasts after. We have 29 mentions of the place Susa before. We have 29 mentions after. We have Haman with the upper hand before and Mordecai with the upper hand after. And the turning point of the entire story of Esther is that the king can't sleep. He's suffering from some insomnia this one night. Now, this is important because the turning point of the story is not about the actions of the characters. Remember, Ahasuerus had just had this feast. He's been drinking wine. He has every reason to be very sleepy, but he's unable to sleep. The turning point is not about the actions of the characters, but about the one behind it all, the Lord God, who is moving those pieces around on his chessboard. And so the theme here in this passage might be this phrase, "It just so happens." And so let me walk again through the story by just thinking about that. Well, it just so happens. Well, it just so happened that this one night, the king was unable to sleep when he should have had plenty of reasons to sleep. It just so happened that Mordecai, back in Esther chapter 2, we saw this, had previously saved the king, but it just so happened that he had gone unrewarded, which was unusual for the culture. Just so happens that this night of sleeplessness, the king asks for his chronicles, the acts of his great kingdom, be read to him. this would have, the chronicles of the king would have been kept, would have been, but very dry. It's like reading the phone book, right? It's just very much matter of fact. Here's what happened. Here's why the king's great. Here's all the great things he's done. And so it's like having the phone book read to him. And it just so happens that the king decides to have this read to him this night. It just so happens that the reader happens to turn to a page from 5 years earlier recording Mordecai saving the king. And it just so happens that the king now, right then, decides, we've got to set this straight. I want Mordecai to be honored right now. Just so happens that at that very moment, Haman appears in the court. Remember, Zeresh said, in the morning, go ask the king, but Haman couldn't even wait. So he just barges in or goes into the palace in the middle of the night. And it just so happens that Haman appears there in the court. Once Haman is brought in, it just so happens that the king asks this question, what should I do to the person whom I desire to honor? It just so happened that the king asked that question without saying the name of the person. The only explanation for all of these just so happens is that God is behind all of this. There's an old adage that says this: coincidences are just God's way of remaining anonymous. You can imagine how this played out in real time. The horror of Haman hearing Mordecai, the Jew, as the one that would be honored. Interesting again that the king would call him Mordecai the Jew as if the king doesn't know, which he probably doesn't, the fact that the Jews are set to be annihilated. And you can imagine the delight on Mordecai of being paraded around by his enemy, Haman, having to honor him. After the parade, Haman returns home publicly mourning, and his wife Zeresh has some bad news that, hey, if this is about the Jews and this is about their God, you will surely fall. Something else is at work and there's no stopping it. But before Haman even has a chance to reflect on all of this, he's whisked away to this second banquet. Esther has chosen to step out in faith. All of us have opportunities in our lives where we're being called to step out in faith. And those decisions of stepping out in faith always require that to be paired with wisdom. Wisdom to do the work, wisdom to do the preparation, wisdom to do the planning and the thinking, to invite wise counsel. But it also requires faith at the same time. Faith that God can use you in those very places that he's called you to. We have wisdom and we have faith brought together. When I read this passage here of Esther 5 and 6, here's what I think it's communicating to us. God uses normal people and mundane events in his invincible plan if we let him. You may be thinking, I'm just a normal person. I'm just an everyday guy, everyday woman. How can God use me? Well, God often uses very normal people, and he often uses just the mundane, normal, average events of our lives for his plan and his purposes, if we let him. Now, let me tease this idea out just a little bit of if we let him. Now, of course, God does not need our permission to work his plan. He is sovereign. He is providential. He's the one behind it all. He doesn't need our permission to do it. However, if we want to be involved in his plan, that often means that we will have to cooperate with his work. Because after all, it is his plan, and we have to be disciplined to place ourselves in the position where we can be involved with what he's doing. And so for this idea, I've got 3 words for us that I want to share with you that are ways for us to think about and have the right sort of attitude that we can be in the right place to be involved and to be used in his plan. So, the first word is time. This idea of time. We cannot rush the plans of God. Came across this little saying not too long ago that has just proven true in my experience. And it's this: God is often almost late. I've shared that before, I know, but God is often almost late. Just when we think it's the 11th hour and there's no turning back, there's no way of winning, God shows up. But we know that that's exactly in his timing all along. Wisdom, when it comes to the timing of decisions and ways of being involved with God's plan, wisdom often encourages us to let decisions simmer. Finding wisdom often requires time. All of us make mistakes along this way. All of us sometimes make a mistake of moving into something too quickly and not giving it the time that it needs for us to be able to make wise decisions, to be right inside of the will of God. I find it so encouraging here that Esther has waited for the right time. She doesn't, even though the situation is dire, she doesn't just bust into the throne room. She waits on the right timing with wisdom to work and prepare her plan to move together and then act confidently with wisdom and with faith, bringing those things together in the right timing. So if we let him, sometimes that just means we need to work in his timing, not in ours. The second word that I have for us of this idea is the word attitude. You see, pride and arrogance get in the way of us being used by God. Our attitude, if incorrect, really can disqualify us from God using us in his plan. His plan's going to be worked out, but the Lord may work it out a different way. I'm reminded of what the book of Proverbs chapter 6 says. It says there are 6 things, this is Proverbs 6:16 through 18. There are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, and hands that shed innocent blood. A heart that devises wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil, false witness who breathes out lies, and one who sows discord among brothers. See, we can have a sort of attitude that the Lord despises. That's an abomination to him. The kind of attitude that the Lord would say, I'm choosing not to use that person if they're going to have that attitude. And of course, we see that type of attitude exemplified here in the enemy of Haman. But all of us are prone sometimes to be selfish, to be arrogant, sometimes even to have evil intentions, even if we don't realize it. So having the right attitude towards what God is doing will help us to be in the place where God can use us to work out his plan. The third word is openness. Are we aware to see what God is doing? Do I see what God is doing? Oftentimes, we think we know how God should work. We think we know what God should do, what he ought to do. And yet, if he is providential and he is sovereign and he is control, we don't get to make the calls. His providence will be on display through his sovereign actions. The question is, are we aware of what he's doing so that we can move forward confidently, being a part of his plan? And that takes awareness, that takes openness, it takes an open heart to see. Is the Lord leading me there? Or is he shutting that door? How can I be open to what he's doing? I want to share 2 stories from my life that illustrate, I think, all of this, the timing, the attitude, and the openness. 2 stories where I've been able to see what God is up to, but oftentimes at the end of it all, we're looking back on it. But I want to share 2 stories. One of them is a positive story from my life, and one of them is a negative story. Let me tell you the positive one first. When I was in high school, I decided I wanted to go to the Naval Academy, and so we began the process of applying to the Naval Academy. And while we were well on our way of filling out and receiving the appointment that would have been necessary, I received a letter in the mail saying that I had been medically disqualified from the Naval Academy. We appealed that decision, and our appeal was rejected. Plan B, I applied to receive the Naval ROTC scholarship to Texas A&M, where I would have graduated A&M and then been commissioned into the Navy. And I actually received that scholarship. I'm sure my parents loved that. Full ride scholarship. I received that scholarship and was set to head that direction, and then received a letter in the mail that I was medically disqualified from that, which we appealed that decision to 3 times, actually 3 times total. So I have 5 rejection letters. You can imagine as a high school senior that was hard to hear, hard to understand, when I really felt like that's what I wanted to do. I had a high school counselor at the time who was very close to us, and we went to church with her, and she just told me one day, she said, Curtis, just the Lord's got something else for you. I looked at her and I said, that's silly, right? So I just didn't think that. At the time, that was hard to handle. Well, it just so happens that because I didn't end up going to the academy or receiving the scholarship, that the spring, just before spring break of my freshman year at Texas A&M, just so happened I was walking through the Memorial Student Center one day, and it just so happened that Pine Cove Christian Camps was there that week interviewing for counselors. And it had just so happened that I had a friend growing up with that his family had gone to Pine Cove, and I was a little familiar with it, and it just so happened that I had the courage to walk up to people I didn't know and ask if I could still apply to be a counselor. Just so happened I could. They told me I had to get my application in tomorrow, the next day. It just so happened that I was able to have the time to fill out the application, call down some references, get everything set up, interview the next day, and was ultimately hired to work for Pine Cove that summer. Well, when you apply to work for camp, you list in preference order the camps that you want to work at. Just so happened that I was selected to work at a camp that I had not prefaced that I wanted to work at all. I ended up working at the family camp outside of Columbus, Texas. Well, I show up to camp working that summer, and it just so happened that another freshman from A&M named Jennifer Allen had also been hired by Pine Cove and also had been hired to work at the same camp that I was working at. And so met her probably at orientation, but I was supposed to work first half and she was supposed to work second half. Now, the Lord did lots of things in my life at camp. I don't have time to share all of those things, and I loved it. He really reawakened a vision for ministry for me. And I loved it so much, I decided I really would want to stay second half and work as well. Well, it just so happened that we had a counselor back out during the first half of summer, a counselor who was supposed to work second half, but during the first half of the summer backed out. And it just so happened that another one of our staffers moved positions that allowed me to stay second half. And it just so happened I was able to work alongside Jennifer Allen and be a counselor with her. And it just so happened that that's how our friendship began. Now, our story is kind of long and windy over the next couple of years of our time at A&M. It's rather comical, where the Lord did a lot of things, and I'll tell you that another time. But it just so happened that all of that came together for me to be able to be there at camp, meeting Jennifer, the Lord reawakening a vision for ministry in my life, and ultimately that would lead all to our engagement and marriage. And when you know, it would just so happen that during that time that I would get to meet Bob and Ann Livesay, that Jennifer and I would. And it just so happened that we would get to know them just a bit. And it just so happened that Pine Cove would hire their son, Reed Livesay, and his wife, Julie. And Jennifer and I would develop a friendship with them. And through Reed and Julie, it just so happened they would reconnect us with Bob and Ann, who did our premarital counseling. And then I fast forward 12 years later, and it just so happened that when Jennifer and I felt like the Lord was moving our hearts to preparing us for something else, that the church that Bob and Ann had helped start were looking for a pastor. And it just so happened I was able to send in my application, my resume, and here we are a year later, right? There's so much more to that story. But as I look back on all of those things and the way that the Lord was working, closing some doors, opening others, providing relationships and opportunities, and I just didn't see any of that at the time. But I look back and I just see the Lord's hand in all of those things. It took His right timing. I could tell you lots more stories, even within this one story, about the timing that it would take. But the right time for God to work out His plan in His timing, and for us to be open to what God was doing. Now, let me tell you another story. That's more of a positive one. Let me tell you a negative one. When Jennifer and I were married, we'd been married a couple of years. We were living in Dallas at the time while I was still at Dallas Seminary, and Jennifer was working in public accounting. Jennifer was working on an audit. We were living in Dallas. She was working on a client actually in Houston. So she spent about 10 weeks in Houston one spring. And she would come back to Dallas on the weekend, one weekend, and then the next weekend I would go down to Houston and stay the weekend with her. And then we would do that for about 10 weeks. Got great hotel points during that time. And it was Super Bowl weekend, this one weekend, and I'm down in Houston visiting her. And so we're sitting there in the hotel room, and I'm watching the Super Bowl on TV. I think Jennifer was over in the corner. I think she was actually working because it was a lot of work to do. And I'm watching the Super Bowl, and then Jennifer looks over at me. We were staying in a hotel that was attached to the Galleria in Houston. And I'm watching the Super Bowl there, enjoying football. And Jennifer looks over at me and she says, Curtis, man, I would love to have a Fresca right now. A Fresca. She was on this Fresca kick. By the way, I've got her permission to tell this story. I'd love a Fresca right now. Well, being the loving and kind and gentle and gracious and caring husband that I was, I hopped right up and said, honey, I would love to go get you a Fresca. Let me go stop everything I'm doing to go get you one. Well, of course I didn't do that. Of course, I very begrudgingly said, okay, I'll go find you a Fresca. So I probably put my shoes on and got out and, just real, kind of, Rode the elevator down to the Galleria, and somewhere about that time, I started thinking, how am I going to pay for this? And then it occurred to me, actually, I have $40 in cash in my wallet. And I clearly remember thinking, that is so unusual. We're like, Jennifer and I are like, most, I don't know, maybe it's a millennial thing. We just rarely carry cash. And we never really have. And I remember thinking very distinctly, wow, isn't that funny that I've got $40 cash in my wallet right now? Well, maybe I'll use that to pay for the fresca if I can find one. And so I start walking around the mall, the Galleria. Now this is, Sunday evening, and things are closing up, and I walk a couple of different places and just striking out. No fresca to be found in the Galleria. And at some point I'm walking around, and this couple approaches me. And they tell me the story, and I don't remember the specifics, but it's a story like probably a lot of you have heard from a stranger on the street, a story about needing some cash to fill their car up with gas to finish their trip home or something like that. And I listened to their story, and okay. And then I ask them, well, how much do you need to get back home? And they tell me, $40. And I thought, isn't that interesting? I was just thinking about having $40, and I don't usually have $40. And now here they are asking for $40. And I looked at them and I said, sorry, I can't help you. And they walked away, and I walked away, and no fresca. Went back up to the room. Sorry, honey, no fresca. Finished watching the Super Bowl. I've never forgotten that moment of that story. Now look, I don't know if they were for real. I don't know if they really needed $40 to get gas to get home. I don't know. But the Lord does. And I've often thought back to that moment as a time where, man, did the Lord want to do something there? Did the Lord want to do something in their lives? Did he want to do something in my life? We were, poor seminary family, and we didn't have a lot of money, but $40, it's $40. Like, at the time, yeah, it felt like a lot. Man, did the Lord want to do something there? And was I just not open to it? Was I just a little arrogant or prideful or proud that I had $40 in my wallet? Right? I don't know what the Lord wanted to do in that moment. But you know what? He's never allowed me to forget it. And I often think back to it of, well, maybe what I've done differently. Were they for real? I don't know. But did I miss an opportunity that the Lord wanted to do something right there? I don't know that either. But maybe I did. Right? God can use normal people in mundane events like a craving for fresca, normal people like me in his invincible plan if we let him. Can God do whatever he wants to do in a variety of ways? Of course he can. But he chooses to use us. And if we'll partner with him, walking in faith with him, he can do great things. And so I just wonder, how could God use you in this season? Could it be maybe a conversation that he's leading you to have, a conversation with a neighbor or a friend? Could it be a conversation, especially in this season, regarding race and racism in our country and what that is like and what that is for an experience of someone that's unlike us, unlike you? Might it be just a place of encouragement where you'd speak encouragement in the lives of a stranger or a family member? Might it be just a simple leading that he would say, bring someone to your mind that you'd pray for, or bring someone to your mind and you just give them a phone call. Hey, I'm thinking about you. You doing okay? Can I get you something? Can I pray for you? Maybe it would be in giving. Maybe it would be an opportunity to give, to donate, to support the work of a church or a charity or a mission organization. Maybe to give in a different way than you've given in the past. How could God use you? See, God uses normal people in mundane events in his invincible plan. If we let him work in his timing, nurturing the right attitudes, and being open to his desires. Lord can do great things. And it might be that it's just so happening that he's doing great things right now and he wants to use you. Would you be open to that? Let me pray for you in that. Father, help us not to be fearful. Help us to be trusting in you as we look to you as the one, as the provider, as the providential one behind all things. Give us faith ultimately in you, beyond our abilities, beyond our stuff, beyond our wisdom, our knowledge. Father, we want you to be on display. And so help us to have the right perspective on timing and attitude and be open to be a part of what you are doing. We pray you do great things, and we're thankful that you use us in that. Prepare us for what you have for us. In Jesus' name, amen.